history of that physical interesting that I am interested in, plus the methodology course.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Scott Harris. I'm Executive Director of Museums here at the University of Mary, Washington. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the James Monroe Museum's 2019 Women's History Month lecture. We appreciate the cooperation and financial support for tonight's presentation from our colleagues in the UMW Department of History and American Studies. And we also gratefully acknowledge the support for all of the museum's public programs, from the Fredericksburg Savings Charitable Foundation, the Paul and Jane Jones Trust, administered by Trustee Walter J. Sheffield, the Stuart Jones Charitable Trust, and the Friends of the James Monroe Museum. There are 2019 program schedules available in the back of the room. We hope you will be able to get to some of our other events this year. And we also invite you to enjoy some refreshments after tonight's lecture. As of the last congressional elections in 2018, roughly 1/4 of members of the United States Senate and House of Representatives are women, the highest percentage to date. The woman who became the first Speaker of the House, female Speaker of the House in 2007, again holds that office, second in line of succession to the presidency. In 1972, Title IX of the Educational Amendments Act stated that, quote, "No person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance." In that same year, 1972, the Equal Rights Amendment passed Congress, beginning a journey toward ratification that is actually still underway. In 1920, the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was ratified, stating, quote, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." Coincidentally, 1920 was the year also of the adoption of the 18th Amendment banning the sale and consumption of alcohol in the United States. A moral and legal victory, albeit a relatively short-lived one, for the temperance movement that women had championed since the 19th century. And on December 18, 1865, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution was adopted, ending slavery in the United States and marking successful conclusion of the abolitionist movement, another crusade in which women figured prominently. Before any of that, before Nancy Pelosi or Martha Griffiths, Alice Paul or Susan B. Anthony, Carrie Nation, or the Grimke sisters, there was Judith Sargent Murray. Tonight we will learn about this woman of James Monroe's era, whose writings on the equality of women in human society inspired generations to come. And we can ask for no better authority than tonight's speaker. Carol Berkin is an American historian and author specializing in women's roles in the early history of our country. She is the author, editor, or co-editor of 14 books, including Revolutionary Mothers, Women in the Struggle for American Independence, A Brilliant Solution, Inventing the American Constitution, which was a History Book Club selection in 2002 that also received the Colonial Dames of America Book Prize in 2004, and Jonathan Sewell, Odyssey of an American Loyalist, which was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize. In addition to teaching and writing, Carol Berkin has been a consultant for many televised historical documentaries appearing on A&E, C-SPAN, History Channel, and PBS. She is the recipient of numerous professional awards recognizing her work as an historian and as an educator. She received an AB from Baruch College and an MA from Columbia University. She also obtained her PhD from Columbia, winning the Bancroft Award for Outstanding Dissertation. Please join me in welcoming to the University of Mary, Washington, Dr. Carol Berkin.
To be someplace where the trees are in bloom. I came from New York, where it is still Narnia. Judith Sargent Murray was born in 1751 into a colonial society whose long-held values and beliefs about gender had slowly begun to be challenged. For the generation that preceded her own, her society had embraced certainties about male and female capacities and roles. 4 powerful pillars of society, religion, science, law, and custom, worked together to ensure as much as possible that the ideal woman was obedient, dependent, and focused narrowly on domestic rather than public affairs. Religion and science had long taught that women were incapable of rational and therefore moral thinking. This assumption was buttressed by the church, the courts, and social expectations, and it justified the need for women to be subservient and obedient to fathers and husbands. Without male guidance and male control, it was argued, women who were irrational would unleash upon the world anarchy and the woes that the Pandora myth warned of, and that Eve's story of willing surrender to the serpent foreshadowed. In colonial households, therefore, the task of socializing children, that is, teaching them right from wrong and preparing them for adult life in society, fell to the father, not to the mother, for his capacity for rational thought ensured the welfare of the community. Women were expected only to train up their daughters in the many domestic skills they would need as wives and mothers. The law effectively operated to ensure a woman's life of dependency, first on her father and then in marriage on her husband. In marriage, a woman became legally invisible. She could not sue or be sued, buy or sell property, keep any of the wages she might earn, or will any of the possessions she brought into the marriage to heirs of her choice. These things, as well as her body, belonged to her husband. In fact, under the law, she was classified, along with idiots and children, as non-compos mentis. Custom and prescriptive literature, that is, those authoritative statements on gender roles, declared that woman's primary role was family reproduction and household production. To be a notable housewife, the gender ideal in the primarily agricultural colonial world, meant to produce the children who would be the labor force in field and home, and to exhibit those skills needed to turn the raw materials she and her husband produced in the fields, in the gardens, and the barn into usable household products. In colonial America, a woman's domain was home and garden. A man's was not only the field or the shop, but also public affairs. The silence expected of a woman in church was matched by an expectation of her silence in political matters. Men could mark their progress to adulthood by becoming an elder in the church, a town officer, or a member of local or colonial government, but the only signpost of woman's journey from childhood to adulthood was marriage and motherhood. Thus, every woman hoped to marry. The alternative was to remain socially a dependent child, no matter what her age. But there were already cracks in this gender ideology when Judith was a child. For by the 1750s, settled cities along the coast had created an urban population who were able, if they were prosperous enough, to abandon household production and farming and purchase most of the supplies they needed. Imported goods from England and Europe found their way into homes like the Sargents. Butcher shops and greengrocers made individual family gardens an avocation, not a necessity, and servants took up the burden of what we would call housework today. Women of the middle and upper classes were thus freed from the daily toil of household production, and along with their husbands, they were becoming committed to a new lifestyle, gentility. Together they pored over etiquette books, followed the latest fashions in clothing and furniture styles, acquired possessions that distinguished them visually from their less fortunate neighbors. Where once wealth meant more of the same things that everyone had, by the time Judith was born, wealth had come to mean having many things their neighbors could not afford. One of the most significant of these things was leisure time. Even marriage itself had begun to take on a different quality. Genteel men and women no longer looked for partners with the requisite skills to manage a farm and a farmhouse. They sought instead companions who shared their tastes, their values, and their social status. As the daughter of one of Gloucester, Massachusetts' most affluent and prestigious gentlemen, Judith Sargent thus grew up in a society experiencing a shift in ideals and behavior that was significant, but was far from a gender revolution. The shift did not shatter the cultural assumptions that men were intellectually superior to women and that education was the birthright of sons, not daughters. Even as a young child, Judith Sargent learned the difficult lesson that no matter how comfortable her upbringing, she was always likely to be considered the inferior of her brothers. Thus, although Judith showed an intellectual curiosity far stronger than her younger brother Winthrop, it was Winthrop who received the formal educational training needed to enter Harvard College. Judith, on the other hand, was expected to be content with learning to read the Bible, to write, and to master fancy sewing and embroidery. She begged her parents to let her sit in on Winthrop's lessons, but they saw no reason to indulge her. What use, they asked, would she have for knowledge of science, history, or philosophy? Winthrop went on to Harvard. Judith remained behind to educate herself. Fortunately for her, this was possible by the 1760s, for books and magazines were now in ready supply to be enjoyed by genteel women who had the leisure time to read. Novels, a relatively new genre, had a particular appeal and significance for girls and women, for they invited the reader to exercise her own imagination. As one historian has put it, the very process of selecting a book to read became an act of self-assertion. Now, Judith read many of these romantic novels, but she also read books on science, history, and philosophy. This self-education did not prevent her, however, from following the expected path of a genteel girl. In 1769, at the age of 18, Judith Sargent married John Stevens, a ship captain from a family as prosperous as her own. By the time Judith and John married, new winds of change were in the air, this time produced by the widespread protest against the new British policies. White colonists, especially those in northern cities like Gloucester, had begun to mobilize in opposition to the mother country. The consequences were dramatic for women as well as men, were drawn almost immediately into very public protest against the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts that preceded the call for independence. Perhaps the most radical impact of the decade of protest and the revolution that followed was this sudden entrance of women into the public and political sphere. Whether they were spinning Liberty cloth to help the boycott of British textiles, or signing newspaper pledges to abstain from tea drinking, or raising funds for the Continental Army, or disguising themselves as men in order to fight in the war, colonial white women were clearly conscious that they had moved beyond their domestic sphere. As one young woman put it, we have commenced perfect statesmen. And male supporters of the war for independence cheered them on, rather than attempting to silence them as they once would have done. The war reached into Judith's private life as well, as it did into the life of many women. Her husband's fortunes, built on shipping, were destroyed as Britain cut off all American trade with the West Indies colonies. By 1787, John was financially ruined. He made a final bid to recoup his losses with a long voyage he took to the West Indies that year, only to die there. Judith remarried the following year to Universalist minister John Murray. This time, however, she refused to give up her maiden name. For the rest of her life, she insisted on being known not as Judith Stevens Murray, but as Judith Sargent Murray. Peace and independence brought other changes to her life. For given women's active participation in every aspect of the war, it seemed unlikely that society's leaders could return to that old ideology of women's mental and moral incapacities. After all, they had made a moral choice to support independence. By 1787, a lively debate had emerged over the role women could and should play in the new republic. It was waged in speeches, newspaper essays, private correspondence, and books. What a century later Freud would call the woman question was thus raised, and Judith Sargent Murray was ready and eager to provide her own answers. Her intellectual journey had begun in her childhood, but two strands of thought influenced her views on the women's question in the 1770s and 80s. The first of these critical strands came from the universalist theology preached by her husband, John Murray. One of its central messages was that men and women might have different physical characteristics, and they might have different roles to play in society, but they were spiritually equals. As Judith herself would later succinctly put it, there is no sex in soul. The second, however, was her immersion in the writings of female philosophers from the late 17th and the early 18th century. Long before Americans had begun to debate the woman question, 17th century English writers had pressed for a reassessment of female capacity for rational thought and intellectual pursuits. In 1694, Mary Astell had published a serious proposal to the ladies. In it, she argued that the denial of formal education, rather than any mental inferiority, was what had kept women in what she called a cloud of ignorance. Astell's second book, Reflections on Marriage, published in 1700, foreshadowed exactly the type of companionate marriages based on mutual esteem and rational friendship that genteel Americans had begun to embrace in Sargent Murray's lifetime. Astell argued that such a marriage was impossible as long as that cloud of ignorance hung over a wife. Female education, she wrote, was essential if men and women were to enjoy marital friendship. What Astell did not advocate was perhaps as important as what she did. She never suggested that female education should or could open the doors to public participation for women, nor did she urge education as a source of individual satisfaction for women. Instead, she argued that education would serve to make a woman a better wife and mother. Education, in short, should not end female domesticity, but enhance it. The later 18th century English female philosophers and reformers that Sargent Murray avidly read would prove much more radical. Historian Catherine Macaulay published a monumental 8-volume history of England between 1763 and 1783, and she did so under her own name, something that women had not done before. Macaulay, who like Judith was self-educated, refused to apologize for writing about politics and history. At the turn of the century, Mercy Otis Warren, Massachusetts' most effective anonymous propagandist, though everyone in the radical circles knew who was writing those plays, most effective anonymous propagandist during the protest years, followed Macaulay's lead, and she published her History of the American Revolution in 1805 under her own name. Judith clearly joined the American post-war debate over the woman question, armed with this combination of universalist theology and Enlightenment philosophy. By 1790, she had begun to publish her own views on gender equality. In On the Equality of the Sexes, she signed it with her pseudonym Constancia, She argued, quote, that women, no less than men, were endowed with imagination, reason, memory, and judgment. Echoing Estelle and Macaulay's 1790 letters on education, she insisted that women's apparent mental deficiencies resulted not from inadequate brains, but from a lack of education. In a postscript to this essay, Constancia displayed Judith's sharp wit and her iconoclasm as she offered a truly radical reinterpretation of the fall of Adam and Eve. Was Eve the weaker of the two, she asked? Did she succumb to temptation more easily than Adam? As Judith saw it, Eve's fall from grace was motivated by a desire of adorning her mind, that is, by intellectual curiosity. Yet it had still taken all the wiles of Satan to persuade her to succumb. Adam, on the other hand, could not claim that he was tricked by the devil himself, nor could he claim to be innocent of the impact of eating the apple, but he saw what it had done to Eve. No, he had surrendered simply because of his attachment to a woman. All Eve had to do, in effect, Judith wrote, was hold out the apple and say, "Here, Adam, have a bite." Sargent Murray could only conclude that Adam's exquisitely soft impulse, his sign of moral deficiency, was in fact a masculine rather than a female trait. 2 years after Sargent Murray's On the Equality of the Sexes appeared in print, the most radical feminist of the era, the English writer Mary Wollstonecraft, published her manifesto, A Vindication of the Rights of Women. In it, she called for financial independence for women and their participation in public affairs. Wollstonecraft's influence on Judith was profound, but it was the experience of American women, left alone to manage farm and family, shop and business, while their husbands went to war, that made Wollstonecraft's call for female economic self-sufficiency resonate powerfully for Judith. She would argue that women, married, widowed, or single, must be allowed to prepare themselves for another event as catastrophic as the war had been. They must acquire the skills that would help them earn a living if they had to, and they must be free of laws that prevented them from doing so. Lived experience, as much as any theoretical argument, motivated Judith to call for economic competency for women. As a young girl, Judith Sargent Murray had cherished a dream of shaping public opinion on important social issues. In the 1790s, this dream seemed to become a reality. Yet she continued to publish her essays under pseudonyms. This, I think, tells us much about the inability of even the brightest and most thoughtful people to overcome their own socialization, to step entirely outside the cultural assumptions held by their society and passed down by their parents. Fearful that she would not be taken seriously if she wrote under her own name, Judith published her most radical writings, the multi-volume Gleaner Essays, under a male pen name. Only much later would she reveal that she was their author. In 1798, in the third volume of the Gleaner, Judith mustered historical evidence to prove that American women's participation in the struggle for independence was part of a long history of heroic women who, as she put it, successfully opposed themselves to tyranny and the galling yoke of oppression. She wrote that in ancient times, when men had failed to resist political and social tyranny, it was women who stepped forward to emancipate their country. She cited female heroes of past eras, including Spartan women, for whom the name of citizen possessed for them greater charms than that of mother, and the women of Hungary who resisted the Ottoman Empire by rushing into flames and enduring the dismemberment of their bodies. Her message was clear. Courage had never been an exclusively masculine virtue. Judith molded her heroines of the past to conform to the ideology of her own era's ideology of Republican virtue. Like Cincinnatus, who answered Rome's call to defend his republic, but returned to his vineyard when the crisis was over, the women Sargent Murray lauded returned to the domestic sphere once their cause had been won. If George Washington was hailed as the American Cincinnatus, the Molly Pitchers and the Deborah Sampsons who returned to the care of home, husband, and children after the war were his female equivalents. Judith also defended the right of women to contribute in artistic realms. During the 1790s, she sought to gain recognition as a writer of poetry and drama, as well as of political essays. Her cousin, Lucius Sargent, revealed that she, quote, wrote poetry by the acre, and every Gleaner essay began with an original poem. Alas, her poems were not very good. They were didactic, highly stylized, and fervently patriotic, though I have to say most of the poems written in America were exactly the same. They were also filled with distracting exclamation points and many underlinings. But, as I said, in her defense, they were no worse than most American poetry by men or by women. She also tried her hand at playwriting, but abandoned the genre after she received really withering reviews. It became clear to her that her legacy would be in the essays that arose from that debate of a women's role in the new American Republic. Judith's Gleaner essays were widely read. Along with Benjamin Rush, Susanna Rowson, and others, she was helping to shape a post-war ideology that raised women's self-esteem and insisted upon their intellectual equality with American men. The 3 volumes of Gleaner remain the most powerful expression of what historians today call the ideology of Republican womanhood, the early republic's ideal of an intelligent, educated woman devoted to husband and family who had accepted the critical civic duty of instilling patriotism in her sons and daughters in order for the American experiment in representative government to survive. Ironically, it's in the Gleaner essays that Judith Sargent Murray's artistic and creative talents are best showcased. The popularity of these volumes arises in no small measure from the fictional characters that populate the essays and that illustrate her most important points. The most compelling of these characters was a young woman named Margaretta, whose story weaves through the Gleaner essays as a kind of serialized melodrama. Margaretta was an orphan, adopted by a childless gentleman and his wife. Judith details Margaretta's education, her courtship, and her marriage as object lessons in proper child rearing by her adoptive parents, but readers were probably more interested in Margaretta's near-fatal attraction to a cad, her ups and downs, emotional ups and downs in her marriage to the very virtuous Edward Hamilton, and her unexpected reunion with her biological father. Neither Judith Sargent Murray nor her companions in that great debate on the woman question were feminist in our modern sense. Her primary goal, like theirs, was the recognition of intellectual and spiritual equality between the sexes, not the upending of gender roles or the dissolution of traditional gender spheres. Although they insisted that women were capable of serving in political offices, they stopped short of ever advocating a formal political role, a formal political voice for women in the new republic. Instead, they called for women to make that civic contribution to society by socializing their children as patriotic citizens. Thus, the agenda in the debate of the woman question was not to move women out of the domestic sphere, but to elevate the social importance of that sphere. For these 18th century writers, the shift from father to mother as the primary civic educator of sons and daughters was a radical change enough. Yet this shift in parental responsibility had unexpected consequences. Those of you who are historians know that's the best part of history, is those unexpected consequences. As these writers and others soon asked, if mothering was such an important critical civic duty, shouldn't women be better prepared to perform those duties? Mothers, in short, simply must be educated. They must know the political theory that framed their republic. They must understand the history that led to its creation. They must be comfortable with valuable scientific and philosophical knowledge. To satisfy these needs, young ladies' academies, boasting curriculum little different from that found in male preparatory schools, arose in every state in the new nation. Judith Sargent Murray lived to see young women go off to study history, philosophy, geography, and even rhetoric, just as her brother Winthrop had done. Although by the third decade of the 19th century, mothering had lost its saliency as a civic role, the rise of female education surely helped open the debate over the woman question when it came up again. For in 1848, women would gather in Seneca Falls to demand an equality that Judith Sargent Murray had never dreamed possible. Thank you. Any questions? Don't ask me anything I can't answer, but I'd be glad to give it a try. Yeah.
How did a lot of these women, they're publishing volumes of books in the 1700s. Was it hard for them to find publishers?
No. No, the end of the 18th century brought about this sort of, because of gentility, this sort of mad desire for, first of all, etiquette books. The Americans were actually very funny. They started reading 17th century etiquette books that were designed for the aristocracy. And they tried to live up to everything that the aristocracy did. Then there was this rush of these novels, Pamela, Tristram Shandy, and then there were local magazines. There was this rise of magazines in America, largely in New England and New York, Pennsylvania. And the magazines were mad for something that women, because they now had this leisure time, could occupy themselves with. And so the Gleaner Essays appeared in the Massachusetts Magazine, and then they were reprinted all across the other states. And so there was a market for this kind of material. The really interesting thing is that some backlash to women having leisure time arose because women were going into their room privately and they were reading novels. And this was considered an absolutely self-indulgent kind of behavior. And there began to be a campaign in the newspapers to stop women from reading novels. I'm going to take even that away. And the funny thing about it is, I think, that men, just as after the War of 1812, the rise of the idea of individualism for men, you know, fulfill your own destiny, be your own man, went up. And the campaign to make sure that women led a life of pure self-sacrifice went up. And so you get the cult of domesticity, you get the 19th century version of all of this, minus any civic role. Now you raised your sons and daughters to be members of their social class. It was very important to teach them table manners and to teach them how to dress. It had nothing to do with saving the republic anymore. But the argument that they shouldn't indulge in self-gratification was going on at exactly the same time as the individual man had developed as a great credo in American society. So once again, women got the wrong end of the stick.
But so publishing houses didn't care if it was a female author, they wanted to sell stories.
Yes, yes. But most, I mean, I think it's very important to understand that here was a woman who really was, for her days, radical. She was afraid to put her own name on what she wrote. She was worried that it would not be taken seriously. She was worried she'd embarrass the family. You know, it's hard to break out of what you were socialized into originally. And I think that that's something that is important to ponder even today. There's a wonderful article when feminist writing first began in American history called Finding Archimedes' Fulcrum. And the argument was, you can never find a position, a place, where you stand outside the socialization you received as a child. You will always bring that baggage with you. And I was rather surprised to discover that here this woman who sounded like, you know, a radical, really carried with her the baggage of what genteel women were supposed to believe when she was growing up. So, you know, it's hard to begin the world anew. Any other questions? Yeah. Uh-oh. Uh-oh.
Judith Sargent Murray, as you said, emphasized the value of education for strengthening families, for strengthening the society in that manner. Was there evidence that that was a genuine, sincere belief on our part, or was it also possibly a tactical way of achieving a strategy of equality without being too threatening?
She and Benjamin Rush and Judith Russell all advocated these young ladies' academies. When you think about the fact that girls' education, Mercy Otis Warren had a nice brother, James Otis, who let her study beside him while he was prepping to go to college. There was so little education of girls. And really, all of a sudden, in the 13 original states, even Georgia, I think they don't have them anymore. I grew up in Alabama, I can speak to this. They founded these schools, and the administrators, I hope I'm not offending any administrators here today. The administrators, of course, were as lazy as administrators always are. And so instead of designing a unique curriculum for the girls' school, they just lifted the boys' preparatory school curriculum and stuck them in and added sewing and dancing. And so these young women who were all from the genteel classes, I mean, there were no scholarships for poor farm girls, these girls got this, they learned Latin, and they learned rhetoric, and you can read the Philadelphia Young Ladies Academy is the one most often quoted because Benjamin Rush was behind that one. And they had a graduation, and you can read the valedictorian or speech of these young women. And they're in the same rhetorical style as you're going to read James Otis's or Patrick Henry's speeches. And so they really got an incredible education. But each of their talks would always end with, and of course, the reason this is important is I can be a better wife to my husband, a better companion to my husband, and I can educate my children about the glories of the Republic. So everybody stopped really short, and even though Judith Sargent Murray spent reams of paper talking about women in the past, Deborah was a judge in the Bible, and Joan of Arc was a hero, she never, ever really came right out and said, women should have a political voice, formal political voice in our society. And so this idea of civic womanhood, or Republican womanhood, was a kind of liminal in-between moment, a position where you were doing something for your society, but you were doing it in your home. And that seemed to be the compromise that people were willing to, male and female were willing to accept. It still is around, right? It's still, I don't want to get too political, but, you know, you can hear parents say, well, you ought to go to a good college so you can be educated and talk with your husband about. No one ever says to a son, you should get educated so you can talk with your wife about something, right? And so that idea that that education serves a purpose for other people. And later in the suffrage movement, the same kind of argument developed. Women said, you have to give us the vote because then we can help clean up society. Then we can help the poor. Then we can, they rarely said, I want political rights because I deserve it, I'm a person. It had to be a sacrifice for someone. It had to be being done for someone else. And that theme has run through feminism to this day, the argument about, do you want equal rights because you deserve it as a citizen, or do you want equal rights because then you can do good for other people? And that has never been resolved. That has never been reconciled, right up until third wave feminism.
And why do you think that is? Why do you think this trend and wave?
If I knew, I would be rich, you know. I think because girls are still educated to believe that they are more inclined to be giving and supportive and helpful than boys. Boys are still raised to believe that in the 19th century, self-interest became good for the country, for men. You pursued your own ambition and somehow magically that helped the whole society. I don't know that girls have ever been taught that. Now there are people who write these books like Lean Forward, but then everybody gets really worked up and says, you know, what about your family? What about your children? So the push and pull of those two things is still very much, I think, alive today. And I don't know if it will ever disappear. I once edited a book that, as a wit once said to me, had a title with 3 words in it no one wanted to hear about: Women, War, and Revolution. And we brought together scholars in Russian history, Cuban history, French history, American history, Chinese history, to write about what happened during these wars of national, with national goals. And the interesting thing is, it was identical. Women were instantly mobilized and politicized. They made major contributions, and afterwards they were told, in Italy it was called patriotic motherhood. In France it was called patriotic motherhood. In America it was called civic motherhood. Now what you're supposed to do is be a good supporter of your husband and raise up patriotic sons. And we were blown away by the fact that that was the arc of women's experience in so many, really disparate and across so many centuries. So I can't solve this problem. If any of you can solve this problem, see me after the lecture. I'd love to hear. But it is definitely the push and pull that you see as early as Judith Sargent Murray and that you continue to see even today. Thank you.
Lemon bars and water away.
We have